interestingly enough, The Mummy, 1999, is credited with establishing the first weekend of May as the start of the summer season for Hollywood blockbusters. So this trend was further cemented by Gladiator 2000, Spider-Man 2002, and the MCU, which had released a film on that weekend nearly every year since Iron Man 2008. So according to director Stephen Sommers, Universal phoned him the morning after the first Mummy was released, and they said to him, "We need another one." So here's the part of the watch party where I give my closing thoughts on what we just saw. So to me, what started with Bram Stoker's Dracula at the beginning of the decade ended with The Mummy. Anybody who has ever mocked Brendan Fraser in this role, saying that they couldn't take him seriously because of his comedic typecasting in previous films, shut the hell up. Get some damn taste, and you have my express permission to grow up. This was the same nonsense I heard about Adrian Brody in Predators. If it's a convincing act, if it's a convincing role, and the actor is believable in the performance, what's your beef exactly? You're poo-pooing men who got in shape and played tough guys to persuade you into buying into them as the role that they were cast in. You're not asking the impossible of people, like persuading them to think that Taylor Swift is attractive or talented or not annoying. Look, the point is that Fraser utterly crushed in this role, to the point that the whole damn series is known as the Brendan Fraser trilogy. Again, as I mentioned at the top of the watch party, do I wish that this leaned more into horror than comedy? Sure. But if we're going to get a retelling of the Mummy story, I'm thrilled with what we got. Because you can't watch a past classic without people jamming their insert current year politics, no, this movie is not racist. The same people complaining about the Egyptian jailer's stereotypical portrayal today, please believe that they were laughing their asses off along with the rest of us when this movie came out. They're just pretending to be upset about it now to virtue signal. Ain't that right, honest trailers?
Joining O'Connell for the ride is a crude Arab stereotype.
Hey, where'd our smelly little friend get to?
And some arrogant white people on a quest to plunder another culture's sacred artifacts. 1001 Arabian Whites.
Furthermore, how do you have a problem with the Egyptian jailer because of representation, yet conveniently neglect the Magi? Oopsie. Take in all that sweet hypocrisy. Furthermore, if you're bent out of shape that the high priest is portrayed as or is played as by a white guy, okay, then the movie's about one white guy killing another. There, wrap your liberal politics around that one, snowflakes. This movie is the best movie in the Mummy, any Mummy film. And it's funny to me that virtue signaling little pubes like Doug Walker like to pretend that the original 1932 version's legacy was disgraced by the 1999 remake. You know what's a disgrace, you talentless hack? That the 1932 movie is a ripoff of the 1931 Dracula movie.
Now, there is actually a lot of Dracula in The Mummy, and that's because, say, John Balderson had written the original stage play, which the Universal Dracula was based on, and he'd had a hand in the script. Now, I think you notice very quickly there are numerous similarities in the plot of Universal's Dracula and this movie, and these are highlighted by several returning alumni as well. David Manners, who plays the young Frank Wemple, our romantic hero, his part is pretty much identical to that of Jonathan Harker, which he played in the 31 Dracula. Likewise, Professor Mueller is played by Edward Van Sloan, who was recommended for the role by Balderson, who had previously played Van Helsing in the Universal Dracula 2. And this does lead many people to think that The Mummy is very much a retread of Dracula. And we do have, a large overlap in the cast. Plot-wise, you have the old sage who realises the power of this ancient evil that's invading their lives, and the targeting of a young woman and a young fiancé who will be our hero. And we also even have in the opening the use of Swan Lake as the film's main theme for the titles as well, just like Dracula. And like Dracula, it was sold as a weird love story. Now this scene here, this is another thing where a lot of people go, this is just Dracula revamped. Because we have this essentially Van Sloan confronting the monster with his own true nature, and a mirror of the famous scene in Dracula where Van Helsing catches out the Count with a mirror in a box.
Oops! I really like the Benny character. I love cowardly characters, not just for comedic effect, but as we saw in this film, they really do make other characters look better by comparison, elevating both your hero and villain. One closing piece of trivia. In 2004, the Universal Studios theme park, both in Hollywood and Orlando, they opened their Revenge of the Mummy rides based on both this movie and The Mummy Returns sequel. The ride became so popular that lines would stretch into the main park with riders waiting for hours in the hot California or Florida sun. To alleviate the stress of waiting, when the lines would finally begin moving, fans of the movie would wearily chant, Imhotep, Imhotep, as the hypnotized townspeople do halfway through the movie. Now, what I'm about to mention might sound like a curveball, but I ask that you keep an open mind and you stick with me. I very much am a fan of mummy fiction and mummy movie. Well, I'm an enthusiast of mummy films. I wouldn't say a fan just because a lot of them aren't good. But to me, these movies, or the concept of mummies returning from the grave, they have a lot in common with the Hellraiser movies. Hear me out. Both have usage of puzzle boxes. Both incorporate high priests. They both involve reviving corpses. Both franchises and film concepts, they include horrors inflicted upon humans, whether through curses, hellish torture, or desiccation. Both use a form of a Pandora's box, whether through Le Marchand's toy box or reading from the Book of the Dead. Both include an underworld, whether the Egyptian afterlife or the Labyrinth of Leviathan. And to me, Hellraiser was always, or should be, the film that mummy movies are jealous of, just because they not only do they have all of those same ingredients, but man, they really deliver on each of these tropes in really frightening ways. For instance, think about how the uncle in the Hellraiser, the first Hellraiser movie, returns from the grave, just reforming as a corpse in the attic. And you know, the other tropes that I mentioned, I'm telling you, these two movie monsters and films, they have much more in common than people would realize upon face value. And the Hellraiser films, just within the context of those key ingredients that I mentioned, anyone who would want to legitimately do a Mummy film, they would be wise to take cues from the Hellraiser movies. So, let me get the obvious out of the way. To relegate the 1999 Mummy film as a mere comedy movie or Indiana Jones knockoff is to dismiss everything that this film got right. The story, the effects, both practical and CGI, the quirky, over-the-top, colorful characters, the inclusion of the canopic jars as MacGuffins, the inclusion of the Egyptian plagues, the casting, the scenery of the Lost City and the underground catacombs, the special effects of a believable walking corpse, the menacing portrayals of the scarabs, the involvement of the Magi, the booby traps of the pyramid, the Book of the Dead, Imhotep, not only regenerating as the film went on, but gradually growing back flesh, bone, and skin by targeting the trespassers that stole his organ jars. The digital effects here pushed the envelope of what was started with Jurassic Park. Not only that, the blockbuster effects with the Egyptian plague and the sand wall, they just go to show how far cinema had come. And this film deserves credit for that. The curse, the canopic jars, the plagues of Egypt, the villain regeneration, all that is tied together. Like, give this film its due. I would like to close out with 2 trivia points. Well, actually, no, a couple different trivia points. The novelization gives some details that probably would have been difficult to convey in the movie, such as some of the Carnahan's backstory, the brother and the sister, and the cause and effect of their parents' deaths. So, among other things, pouring the scarabs into Imhotep's sarcophagus wasn't just to torture him further. It's an essential part of the ritual that they would eat his flesh, and when he became desperate, he would eat them, and this would continue for years. This dark mockery of the cycle of life was an important aspect of making him immortal, so that he would suffer forever. There was a lot more detail in the original script that was cut for pacing, including an expansion of Imhotep's backstory, the rest of the plagues, and tidbit explanations of minor issues. The original script and the movie novelization provide an explanation as to why Imhotep's corpse is still juicy after thousands of years. As mentioned, the scarabs thrown into the sarcophagus were considered sacred, and by eating them, Imhotep is condemned to live forever. Likewise, the high priest Imhotep is considered a sacred man, and by eating him, the scarabs are condemned to live forever. The intention is that both the scarabs and Imhotep would be condemned to eternal life, eating each other forever.
For all eternity, idiot.
This next section I refer to as the casting call. So, Rachel Weisz was the only actress offered her specific part. Leonardo DiCaprio was rumored to have been offered the role of Rick O'Connell. It's believed that DiCaprio was said to have loved the script and wanted to be in the film. However, he had already agreed to star in The Beach 2000. It's also been said that DiCaprio asked if The Beach could be delayed so he could film The Mummy, but producers refused. However, filming of The Beach was delayed anyway. Go figure. Stephen Dunham auditioned for the role of Rick O'Connell. He was rejected, but Stephen Sommers liked his acting so much that he made the character Mr. Henderson just for him. At one point, Bruce Campbell and Kurt Russell were considered for the role of Rick O'Connell. Before Brendan Fraser, the role of Rick O'Connell was also offered to Sylvester Stallone. Could you imagine? Tom Cruise, Brad Pitt, Matt Damon, Ben Affleck, Chris O'Donnell, and Matthew McConaughey were considered for the role of Rick O'Connell, and Tom Cruise would later star in the lead in the reboot, The Mummy 2017. The less said about that debacle, the better. Moving on. Director's chair. When Clive Barker was attached to the project, the film was intended to be a low-budget horror film. Barker's vision for the film was violent, with the story revolving around the head of a contemporary art museum who turns out to be a cultist trying to reanimate mummies. George A. Romero was brought in with a vision of a zombie-style horror movie similar to Night of the Dead, but this was considered too scary. Sam Raimi was considered for directing the film as well. Joe Dante's version would have cast Daniel Day-Lewis as the Mummy. This version, which was co-written by John Sayles, was set in contemporary times and focused on reincarnation with elements of a love story. It came close to being made, with some elements like the flesh-eating scarabs making it to the final product. However, at that point, the studio wanted a film with a budget of $15 million and rejected Dante's version. Heading back to George Romero's version, his vision, as mentioned, was a zombie-style horror movie similar to Night of the Living Dead, but which also relied heavily upon elements of tragic romance and ambivalence of identity. Romero completed a draft in October of '94, co-written by Alan Ormsby and John Sayles, that revolved around female archaeologist Heaven Grover and her discovery in Abydos of the tomb of Imhotep, an Egyptian general who lived in the time of Ramesses II. So, unfolding in a nameless American city in modern times, events are set in motion when Imhotep inadvertently wakes as a result of his preserved cadaver having been exposed to rays from an MRI scan in a high-tech forensic archaeology lab. The script then progresses to a fish-out-of-water story when Imhotep, having regained his youthful appearance, recognizes the need to adapt to a contemporary society that is 3,000 years removed from when he came from. So, assuming at first that he is a representative from the Bureau of Antiquities, Helen finds herself drawn into a tentative relationship with Imhotep, while also experiencing clairvoyant flashbacks to a previous life in 19th Dynasty Egypt as a priestess of Isis. Summoning mystical powers through incantation, Imhotep later resurrects the mummy of Charis, a loyal slave whose body had been resting alongside his master's in the same tomb, but is now held in the local museum. After escaping in the city sewer system, Charis embarks on a vengeful rampage against the various criminal fences and high society antiquarians who had acquired stolen relics from his tomb. So, Romero's script was considered too dark and violent by James Jacks and the studio, who wanted a more accessible picture. Compounding the issue was the fact that Romero was unable to extricate from a contract for a different film project he had in negotiation at the time with MGM. And so, his involvement with the film was severed, and the development of an entirely new script was commissioned to other writers. Interestingly enough, I had read up on Clive Barker's adaptation. He did it along with Nick Garris, who wrote the script. Seemingly, all these other directors, especially Clive Barker, were trying to think outside the box. Lo and behold, all along, it turns out that Universal Studios was indeed was looking for something that was more cliched. Go figure. The studio's trying to... I mean, look, I'm happy with what we got in The Mummy 1999, but go figure that the studios would focus on doing something that's more familiar and was more tropish than something unique. So, here's the part where I like to do recommendations of other films based on what we've already seen. So, why not make it a shockbuster night?
There's a formula to it. A very simple formula.
Make it a blockbuster, right?
So, I would like to recommend movies that are similar in tone to this. First up would be Army of Darkness, another dark fantasy film. And how appropriate, since Bruce Campbell had previously been considered for the role. A different horror comedy or horror film that with levity to it would be Sleepy Hollow. I believe it came out in the same year, 1999. And lastly, I would go with Deep Rising, made by the same director. Therefore, mark your calendars and say your prayers. I've been Inkarnate, offering a word of caution. Fear the worst, so long you recognize who's best.
If you're resigned to your fate, time to subscribe to your fears.
Warn your friends. Warn everyone.